They called me dramatic, said I was attention-seeking. My own family rolled their eyes every time I winced in pain, whispering behind my back that I was milking it for sympathy. For 3 agonizing months, I endured not just physical agony, but the crushing weight of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to care about me most. But when that X-ray lit up the screen in Dr. Martinez's office, the silence in that room was deafening, and suddenly, nobody was calling me dramatic anymore. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. It all started on a seemingly perfect Saturday morning in October. I'm Athena Adams, and at 24, I was living my best life in Portland, Oregon. I had just landed my dream job as a graphic designer at a trendy marketing firm downtown, finally moved out of my parents' house into my own apartment, and was training for my first half marathon. Life felt like it was finally clicking into place. That morning, my younger brother Jake had invited me to join him and his college buddies for what he called a casual hiking trip up Mount Tabor. Jake was always the adventurous one in our family, the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. At 21, he was a star athlete at Portland State, studying kinesiology, and somehow managed to make everything look effortless. Meanwhile, I'd always been the cautious older sister, the one who preferred art galleries to rock climbing and coffee shops to camping trips. But I'd been trying to break out of my comfort zone lately, especially since my recent breakup with my ex-boyfriend, Marcus, had left me feeling like I needed to rediscover who I was outside of that relationship. So when Jake suggested the hike, I figured it was the perfect opportunity to bond with my brother and maybe prove to myself that I could be more adventurous. The group consisted of Jake, his girlfriend Riley, and 3 of his fraternity brothers, Connor, Brett, and Tyler. They were all typical college athletes, loud, confident, and completely convinced of their own invincibility. I felt a bit out of place in my brand new hiking boots and carefully researched outdoor gear, but I was determined to keep up. The first part of the hike went smoothly. Mount Tabor isn't exactly Everest. It's more of a gentle incline through a beautiful park, but there are some steeper, more challenging trails if you know where to look. And, of course, Jake's crew wasn't interested in the tourist-friendly paths. They wanted to tackle what Brett called the real deal, a steep, rocky section that wasn't officially maintained by the Park Service. I should have spoken up. I should have said I wasn't comfortable with the terrain. But I didn't want to be the killjoy, the anxious older sister who couldn't hang with the college kids. So I followed them up increasingly treacherous paths, my heart pounding, not just from exertion, but from genuine fear. The accident happened so fast. We were navigating a particularly steep section where loose rocks and gravel made every step precarious. Connor had just made a joke about how easy it was, showing off by practically jogging up the incline, when my left foot hit a patch of wet leaves covering loose stones. I felt my ankle roll in a way that ankles definitely aren't supposed to roll. The sound it made, a sickening pop, followed by what I can only describe as a grinding sensation, made my stomach lurch. But it was the pain that really got my attention. It wasn't the sharp, immediate pain you'd expect from twisting an ankle. This was deeper, more complex, like something fundamental had shifted inside my leg. I went down hard, sliding several feet down the rocky slope before Jake managed to grab my arm and stop my descent. The pain was so intense that for a moment I couldn't even scream. It felt like electricity was shooting up my entire left side. And when I finally managed to look down at my ankle, I could see it was already starting to swell at an alarming rate. "Oh man, that looked brutal," Tyler said, but he was already looking around, eager to keep moving. "You gonna be okay to keep going?" I tried to stand, thinking maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt, but the moment I put any weight on my left foot, the pain nearly made me pass out. "I don't think I can walk on this," I managed to say through gritted teeth. Jake, to his credit, looked genuinely concerned for about 30 seconds, but then Riley started complaining about how they were going to miss the sunset from the summit if we didn't hurry, and Connor pointed out that we were only halfway up the trail. The group dynamic shifted quickly from concern to impatience. "It's probably just a sprain," Jake said, though he hadn't actually looked at my ankle closely. "You know how you tend to catastrophize things, Athena. Remember when you thought you had appendicitis and it was just gas?" That stung. Yes, I'd had a few false alarms with health issues over the years, what the family lovingly referred to as my hypochondriac phase during my early 20s, but this felt different. This felt serious. Brett, who was apparently pre-med, took a cursory look at my ankle and pronounced it definitely sprained, but probably not broken. He wrapped it loosely with an elastic bandage from someone's first aid kit and suggested I could probably walk it off if I took it slow. The descent was a nightmare. Every step sent waves of pain up my leg, and I had to stop frequently to rest and try to manage the agony. The group grew increasingly frustrated with our slow pace, making comments about how we were going to be hiking in the dark soon and how they had plans that evening. By the time we reached the parking lot, my ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size and had turned an impressive array of colors: deep purple, angry red, and a sickly yellow-green around the edges. But when I pointed this out, Connor just shrugged and said that was normal for a bad sprain. Jake drove me home to my apartment, and I could tell he was annoyed about having to cut his day short. "You'll be fine by Monday," he said as he helped me hobble to my front door. "Just ice it and take some ibuprofen. You're tougher than you think." But I wasn't fine by Monday. If anything, the pain had gotten worse. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done in my 6 months at the company, and spent the day with my foot elevated, rotating between ice packs and heating pads, desperately trying to find a position that didn't make me want to cry. When I called my mom, Linda Adams, to tell her what happened, her response was less than sympathetic. "Oh, Athena, you know how you get about these things. Remember your concussion from that fender bender that turned out to be nothing? Jake said you took a little tumble, but you're probably just sore. Give it a few days." My dad, Robert, was even more dismissive when I talked to him that evening. "Your generation doesn't know what real pain is," he said with the authority of someone who'd worked construction for 30 years. "When I was your age, I broke 3 ribs and still finished my shift. You sprained your ankle on a walk in the park. Take some aspirin and walk it off." But I couldn't walk it off. By Wednesday, I was using crutches I'd borrowed from a neighbor just to get around my apartment. The pain wasn't getting better, it was getting worse, and it had developed new characteristics that worried me. Sometimes it felt like burning, sometimes like stabbing, and sometimes like a deep, grinding ache that seemed to come from inside my bones. I finally managed to get an appointment with Dr. Sarah Kim, a family physician at the clinic near my apartment. She was young, probably not much older than me, but she listened carefully as I described what had happened and how I was feeling. She examined my ankle thoroughly, moving it gently in different directions and asking detailed questions about the pain. "I'd like to get some x-rays," she said finally. "This level of swelling and pain, especially lasting this long, suggests there might be more going on than a simple sprain." When I mentioned this to my family at our usual Sunday dinner that week, hobbling into my parents' house on crutches, the reaction was predictably skeptical. "X-rays for a twisted ankle," my dad scoffed. "What a waste of money. These young doctors just want to run up your bill with unnecessary tests." My mom nodded in agreement. "Honestly, Athena, you're being dramatic again. It's been less than a week. Injuries take time to heal, especially when you keep babying them." Even Jake, who had at least witnessed the accident, seemed to have minimized it in his memory. "I mean, it wasn't that bad of a fall," he said, helping himself to seconds of Mom's famous pot roast. "You slid like 3 feet. I've had worse falls just getting out of bed." The worst part wasn't just their dismissiveness. It was the way they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I caught whispered conversations about my attention-seeking behavior and my tendency to make mountains out of molehills. My Aunt Carol, who had joined us for dinner, even suggested that maybe I was subconsciously exaggerating my symptoms because I was still processing the breakup with Marcus. Sitting there at my childhood dining room table, surrounded by family members who were supposed to love and support me, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life.
The physical pain was bad enough, but the emotional pain of being dismissed and disbelieved by my own family was almost unbearable. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom where I'd stayed because I couldn't manage the stairs to my apartment, I made a decision. I was going to get those x-rays, regardless of what my family thought. Something was wrong, really wrong, and I was the only one who seemed to care enough to find out what it was. The x-ray appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday, nearly 2 weeks after my accident. Dr. Kim had managed to squeeze me in as a semi-urgent case, though getting there proved to be its own challenge. My ankles still couldn't bear any weight, and navigating Portland's public transportation system on crutches during rush hour was like running an obstacle course designed by someone who genuinely hated disabled people.
I'd asked Jake if he could drive me to the appointment, but he had practice. My mom was busy with her book club. Apparently, discussing the latest romance novel was more pressing than her daughter's potential medical emergency. Dad was working, as always. So I found myself awkwardly maneuvering onto the Max light rail, trying to balance on crutches while commuters pushed past me like I was invisible. The imaging center was in one of those sterile medical complexes that all look identical. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and the distinctive smell of antiseptic that somehow manages to be both clean and unsettling. The technician, a middle-aged woman named Diana, with kind eyes and gentle hands, helped position my ankle for the x-rays. "Honey, this looks pretty swollen still," she said as she carefully adjusted my foot. "How long ago did this happen?" 2 weeks, I replied, and I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. 2 weeks and it's still this swollen? No wonder your doctor wants pictures. Let's see what we're dealing with.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The x-ray process was surprisingly quick, but the waiting afterward felt eternal. Diana told me the images would be sent to Dr. Kim within a few hours, and I should hear back by the end of the day. I hobbled home to my apartment, I'd finally managed to navigate my stairs again, and spent the afternoon alternating between anxiously checking my phone and trying to distract myself with Netflix. Dr. Kim called at 4:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock for what felt like hours. "Athena, I need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning," she said, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. "I have your x-ray results, and we need to discuss them in person." "Is it bad?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Let's talk tomorrow. Can you be here at 8 a.m.? I'm squeezing you in before my regular appointments." That night was one of the longest of my life. I barely slept, my mind racing through possibilities. Part of me was terrified about what the x-rays might have revealed, but another part, a part I was almost ashamed to acknowledge, felt vindicated. Finally, I might have proof that I wasn't being dramatic or attention-seeking. I didn't tell my family about the appointment. I was tired of their dismissive comments and skeptical looks. Whatever Dr. Kim had to tell me, I wanted to hear it without the background noise of my family's disbelief. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic early and sat in the waiting room, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. When Dr. Kim called my name, I noticed she looked more serious than she had during my initial visit. Her office was small but comfortable, with diplomas lining one wall and a small collection of succulents on the windowsill. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, then pulled up what I assumed were my x-ray images on her computer screen. "Athena, I want to start by saying that your instincts were absolutely right to push for these x-rays," she began, turning the monitor so I could see the images. "What we're looking at here is not a simple sprain." The x-ray looked like abstract art to me, black and white shapes that could have been anything, but Dr. Kim pointed to specific areas as she explained what she was seeing. "You have multiple fractures in your ankle," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "Here, you can see a complete break in your fibula, that's the smaller bone in your lower leg, and here, there's a spiral fracture in your tibia, the larger bone. Additionally, you have what we call a displaced fracture in your talus, that's one of the bones that makes up your ankle joint." I stared at the screen, trying to process what she was telling me. Multiple fractures? But everyone said it was just a sprain. I'm not surprised people thought that initially. Ankle injuries can be deceptive, especially when there's a lot of swelling that masks the severity. But these are significant fractures, Athena. The fact that you've been walking on this for 2 weeks? She shook her head. You must have an incredibly high pain tolerance. So I wasn't being dramatic? Dr. Kim looked at me with something that might have been anger, not at me, but on my behalf. Dramatic? You've been functioning with 3 separate fractures for 2 weeks? Most people would be screaming in pain. You were completely justified in every complaint you made. She pulled up another view of the x-ray. This spiral fracture here is particularly concerning. It suggests the injury involved significant rotational force, much more than a simple slip or fall would typically cause. When you described sliding down that rocky slope, the twisting motion as you fell likely caused your ankle to rotate while your foot was planted, creating these complex breaks.
What does this mean for treatment? I asked, though I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I had been walking around with multiple broken bones. You need surgery, and soon. These fractures won't heal properly on their own, especially the displaced one in your talus. We're talking about installing plates and screws to hold everything in the correct position while it heals. Without surgical intervention, you could face chronic pain, arthritis, and permanent mobility issues. The room felt like it was spinning. Surgery, plates and screws, permanent mobility issues. 2 weeks ago, I'd been training for a half marathon. I'm going to refer you to Dr. Martinez. He's one of the best orthopedic surgeons in Portland for this type of injury. But Athena, I need to stress how important it is that we move quickly. The longer these bones remain displaced, the more complicated the repair becomes. Dr. Kim printed out copies of the x-rays and handed them to me along with her referral notes. I want you to take these with you when you tell your family. Sometimes people need to see the evidence to understand how serious an injury really is. As I left her office, clutching the envelope containing my x-rays, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that I finally had validation for what I'd been experiencing, anger that it had taken 2 weeks of being dismissed and disbelieved to get to this point, fear about the surgery and what my recovery would look like, and underneath it all, a grim satisfaction that I was about to prove wrong every person who had called me dramatic. I decided to go straight to my parents' house. My mom would be home. She worked part-time as a substitute teacher, and Fridays were usually her day off. I wanted to have this conversation while the doctor's words were still fresh in my mind, while my indignation was still sharp and focused. The drive to my childhood home took 20 minutes, and I spent the entire time rehearsing what I would say. I pictured my mom's face when she saw the x-rays, imagined her apologies and promises to take me more seriously in the future. Part of me was looking forward to the vindication, though I wasn't proud of that feeling. Mom was in the kitchen when I let myself in through the back door, surrounded by the ingredients for what looked like her famous chocolate chip cookies. She looked up in surprise when she saw me. "Athena, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at work?" "I had a doctor's appointment," I said, settling myself carefully onto one of the kitchen stools, "about my ankle." She sighed, the same exasperated sound she'd been making whenever I mentioned my injury. "Honey, we've talked about this. You need to give these things time to heal. All this running to doctors isn't going to make you better any faster." I pulled the envelope from my purse and set it on the counter between us. "I got x-rays." "X-rays for a sprain? That seems excessive." "Mom, I need you to look at these." I opened the envelope and pulled out the films, holding them up to the kitchen light. Dr. Kim explained everything to me. She barely glanced at the images. "Honey, I can't read x-rays. I'm sure whatever the doctor told you." "I have 3 fractures." The words hung in the air between us. My mom stopped stirring her cookie dough and looked at me properly for the first time since I arrived. 3 what? Fractures, broken bones, a complete break in my fibula, a spiral fracture in my tibia, and a displaced fracture in my talus. I need surgery. Each word felt deliberate, important, like I was finally speaking a language that might cut through 2 weeks of dismissal.
For the first time since my accident, my mother looked genuinely concerned. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer to examine the x-rays I was still holding up to the light. "Are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood." "Mom, I've been walking around with 3 broken bones for 2 weeks, while you and Dad and Jake kept telling me I was being dramatic." My voice was steadier than I felt. Dr. Kim said most people would be screaming in pain with injuries like this. I watched as the reality of what I was telling her slowly sank in. The color drained from her face, and she reached out tentatively to touch the edge of one of the x-ray films. "Surgery?" she whispered. "Plates and screws, and if I don't get it done soon, I could have permanent damage." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of our neighbor's lawnmower. My mom sank into the chair across from me, still staring at the x-rays like they might change if she looked at them long enough. "I'm so sorry," she finally said, but her voice was small and uncertain, like she was still trying to catch up to this new reality. "We had no idea it was this serious." "I tried to tell you it was serious. I told you the pain was getting worse, not better. I told you something felt wrong. I wasn't yelling, but there was steel in my voice that I'd never used with my mother before, and you called me dramatic." The back door opened, and Jake walked in, still in his practice gear, looking for his usual post-workout snack raid of Mom's kitchen. "Hey, what's up?" he said, then noticed the x-rays spread across the counter. "What's all this?" "Your sister has 3 broken bones in her ankle," my mom said quietly. "She needs surgery." Jake's confident smile faltered as he looked between the x-rays and my face, trying to process this information that didn't fit with the narrative he'd constructed about my minor tumble on Mount Tabor. "Wait, what? 3 broken bones? But you've been walking around." "On 3 broken bones, for 2 weeks, while everyone told me I was overreacting." The silence that followed was different from any silence our family had ever shared. It was heavy with the weight of realization, thick with the implications of how wrong they had all been. And for the first time in 2 weeks, nobody was calling me dramatic. The aftermath of my revelation in Mom's kitchen was unlike anything I'd experienced in our family before. Jake stood frozen by the refrigerator, a half-eaten apple in his hand, staring at the x-rays like they were evidence of his own crime. Mom had gone pale and kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again without saying anything. Dad arrived home from work about an hour later to find all 3 of us still sitting around the kitchen table in uncomfortable silence. The x-rays were spread out like tarot cards predicting a very grim future. And the cookie dough Mom had been working on sat abandoned in its bowl, probably ruined by now. "What's all this?" Dad asked, loosening his tie as he surveyed the scene. He looked tired. He always looked tired after his long days managing the construction crews. But there was something in the atmosphere that made him pause. "Robert, sit down," Mom said quietly. "Athena has something to show you." I repeated the entire explanation for my father, watching his expression change from mild irritation to confusion to something that might have been shocking. Dad had always prided himself on being tough, on his ability to work through pain and push past minor injuries. His construction site stories usually involved men finishing their shifts with cuts that needed stitches or working through sprains that would sideline lesser mortals. But as I pointed to each fracture on the x-rays, explaining what Dr. Kim had told me about the severity and the urgent need for surgery, I watched my father's construction-hardened confidence crumble. 3 breaks, he said finally, running a hand through his graying hair. "Jesus, Athena, 3 actual breaks. And I've been walking on them for 2 weeks while you all told me to stop being dramatic." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I noticed he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Mom was clutching her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "We didn't know," she said, but it sounded hollow even to her. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. I told you something was seriously wrong. I told you the pain was getting worse. I could barely walk, Mom. I was using crutches, and you still called it dramatic? Dad cleared his throat, the way he always did when he was trying to take charge of a situation that had gotten out of his control. Okay, well, what matters now is getting you the help you need. When's the surgery scheduled? I haven't scheduled it yet. I have to see the orthopedic surgeon first, Dr. Martinez. Dr. Kim is trying to get me in as soon as possible, but it might be Monday before I can get an appointment. Monday? Mom looked horrified. But you said it was urgent. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 hours ago, she'd been suggesting I was wasting money on unnecessary medical tests. Now she was concerned about waiting 3 days for a specialist appointment. Jake finally found his voice. Athena, I'm really sorry. I had no idea when you fell that it was that serious. It happened so fast, and you got up and everything. I got up because you guys were impatient to keep hiking. I got up because I didn't want to ruin your day. I got up because I've spent my entire life trying not to be the sister who holds everyone back. My voice was getting louder, and I could hear the anger that I'd been suppressing for 2 weeks finally finding its way to the surface. That's not fair, Jake protested. I would never want you to hurt yourself just to keep up with us. Wouldn't you? Because when I said I couldn't walk on it, your immediate response was to tell me I was catastrophizing. When I was clearly in pain, you guys complained about having to hike in the dark. When I needed help getting down that mountain, Brat gave me a 5-second medical evaluation and declared it probably not broken. Jake's face flushed red. Brett's pre-med. He knows about injuries. Brett's a college sophomore who's taken maybe 1 anatomy class. He's not qualified to diagnose a stubbed toe, let alone complex fractures. The fight that followed was one of the most intense our family had ever had. Jake defended his friends and his decisions, insisting that anyone could have made the same mistake. Dad tried to play mediator while simultaneously making comments about how these things happen and there's no point dwelling on what's done. Mom kept apologizing, but also making excuses about how busy everyone had been and how I'd cried wolf with health scares before. But something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't backing down. The X-rays had given me something I'd never had before, undeniable proof that my experience was valid. I wasn't being dramatic. I wasn't overreacting. I was injured, seriously injured, and I had been from the moment I fell on that rocky slope. You want to know what the worst part is? I said, gathering up the X-rays and sliding them back into their envelope. It's not the broken bones. It's not even the surgery I have to have. It's that for 2 weeks, the people who are supposed to love me most in the world made me feel crazy for being in pain. I stood up, balancing carefully on my crutches. I'm going home. I'll let you know when the surgery is scheduled. Athena, wait, Mom called, but I was already heading toward the door. Honey, don't leave like this, Dad said, following me. We're family. We work through things. I turned back to look at him. Family doesn't dismiss each other's pain. Families don't roll their eyes when someone says they're hurting. A family doesn't spend 2 weeks making someone feel like they're losing their mind. The drive home was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. Part of me felt victorious. I'd finally been vindicated, finally had proof that I wasn't the hypochondriac they'd painted me as. But another part of me felt profoundly sad. The people I'd counted on to support me had failed me when I needed them most, and seeing the shock on their faces when confronted with the X-rays only highlighted how completely they dismissed my experience. My phone started ringing before I even made it back to my apartment. First Mom, then Dad, then Jake. I let them all go to voicemail. I needed time to process everything that had happened, and I wasn't ready to accept their apologies or listen to their excuses. Dr. Martinez's office managed to fit me in for a consultation on Saturday morning. Apparently, Dr. Kim had impressed upon them the urgency of my situation. The orthopedic clinic was in a different part of the city, in one of those modern medical buildings with floor-to-ceiling windows and abstract art that was probably supposed to be soothing, but mostly just looked expensive. Dr. Martinez was older than Dr. Kim, probably in his 50s, with the kind of confident demeanor that comes from decades of putting people's bones back together. He examined my ankle with gentle, expert hands, then pulled up my x-rays on a large monitor that made the fractures look even more dramatic than they had on Dr. Kim's small computer screen. "Well, you've certainly done a thorough job here," he said with a slight smile. "How long ago did this happen?" 2.5 weeks. His eyebrows raised. "And you've been walking on this?" Everyone thought it was just a sprain. Everyone was wrong. He pointed to the screen. "This is a trimalleolar fracture. That means you've broken all 3 major bone structures that make up your ankle joint. The fibula here, the tibia here, and this break in your talus is particularly concerning because that bone has limited blood supply, which makes healing more complicated." He turned to face me directly. "I'm going to be honest with you, Athena. This is a significant injury that's going to require significant treatment. We're talking about a complex surgery, probably 3 to 4 hours under general anesthesia. I'll need to install multiple plates and screws to stabilize these fractures, and your recovery is going to be lengthy." "How lengthy?" "You'll be completely non-weight-bearing for at least 8 weeks, which means crutches or a wheelchair for everything. After that, we'll gradually introduce weight-bearing, but you're looking at 4 to 6 months before you're walking normally again. Physical therapy will probably continue for close to a year." The reality of what he was telling me settled over me like a heavy blanket. 6 months before I could walk normally? A year of physical therapy? My half-marathon training was obviously out of the question, but this was going to affect every aspect of my life. "There's also the question of long-term effects," Dr. Martinez continued. "With injuries this severe, especially ones that have gone untreated for this long, there's a higher risk of developing arthritis in the joint. You may experience chronic pain or stiffness. Your ankle may never be quite as strong or flexible as it was before." I stared at the x-rays on the screen, trying to reconcile the severity of what he was describing with my family's insistence that I was overreacting. "Dr. Martinez, can I ask you something? Is this the kind of injury that people typically minimize or mistake for something minor?"
He looked at me carefully, and I got the sense that he understood there was more to my question than simple medical curiosity. "Absolutely not. This is a severe, complex injury that would be immediately obvious to any medical professional. The level of pain and disability you must have been experiencing would be consistent with major trauma. Anyone suggesting this was a minor sprain or that you were overreacting was misinformed." My family kept telling me I was being dramatic, that I was catastrophizing. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a different view of my x-rays. "You see this displacement here? This level of bone separation doesn't happen from minor falls or simple sprains. This required significant force and rotational trauma. The fact that you've been functioning at all for 2.5 weeks tells me you have an exceptionally high pain tolerance. Most people with these injuries would be completely immobilized." He printed out several copies of the x-rays and handed them to me. "I don't know your family situation, but sometimes it helps people understand the seriousness of an injury when they can see the actual damage. These aren't subjective symptoms that can be dismissed. These are objective, measurable fractures that require immediate intervention." We scheduled the surgery for the following Thursday. Dr. Martinez wanted to operate as soon as possible, but he needed time to coordinate with the surgical team and ensure the operating room was available for what he expected to be a lengthy, complex procedure. As I left his office, armed with pre-surgery instructions and more copies of my x-rays than I knew what to do with, I realized that my family's reaction to learning about my fractures was just the beginning. The real test of whether they truly understood the severity of what had happened and the gravity of how they treated me was still to come. The week leading up to my surgery was surreal. Word had spread through our extended family about my diagnosis, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about what had happened. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in months, each message a variation of concern mixed with disbelief. My Aunt Carol, who had suggested at that Sunday dinner that I was subconsciously exaggerating due to my breakup, called to apologize. But even her apology felt backhanded. I had no idea it was really serious, honey. You know how you've always been sensitive about medical things, so we just assumed. My cousin Derek, Jake's age and equally athletic, sent a text that read, "Dude, 3 breaks? That's gnarly. Must have been some fall." As if the severity of my injury was somehow impressive rather than devastating. But it was my coworker Melissa who really opened my eyes to how badly my family had handled the situation. I'd finally called my boss, Jennifer, to explain why I'd been out and would need extended medical leave. Jennifer was horrified, not just about the injury, but about the timeline. "Wait, this happened 2.5 weeks ago and you're just now getting surgery?" she asked during our phone call. "Why didn't you get medical attention immediately?" When I explained about my family's reaction and their insistence that I was overreacting, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Athena, I have to ask, are you safe at home? Because what you're describing sounds like medical neglect." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Medical neglect. I'd been so focused on being vindicated about my injury that I hadn't really considered the broader implications of what had happened. My family hadn't just been wrong, they'd actively prevented me from getting necessary medical care for over 2 weeks. Melissa stopped by my apartment that evening with Thai food and wine, ostensibly to check on me before my surgery, but really to conduct what felt like an intervention. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said, settling onto my couch with her pad thai, "about your family's reaction. And I have to say, as someone who cares about you, I'm really concerned." Melissa was one of those people who spoke directly, a quality that had made her both a great friend and occasionally an uncomfortable mirror. She was a few years older than me, recently divorced, and had developed a finely tuned radar for toxic relationship dynamics. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. "I mean, imagine if this had been Jake who got injured. Can you honestly tell me your parents would have spent 2 weeks telling him he was being dramatic?" The question hung in the air between us. I tried to picture my golden child brother hobbling around on crutches while my parents dismissed his pain, but the image wouldn't form. Jake had always been taken seriously when he was hurt. His sports injuries throughout high school had been treated with immediate medical attention and careful rehabilitation. "That's different," I said weakly. "Jake's an athlete. His injuries affect his performance." "And your injuries don't affect your life, your job, your ability to function as a human being?" Melissa's voice was gentle but firm. "Athena, you've been walking around with 3 broken bones while your family told you to stop complaining. That's not normal family dynamics." She was right, and I knew it, but acknowledging it felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. It was easier to focus on being vindicated about my injury than to examine the deeper patterns of how my family treated me. "I think there's something else you need to consider," Melissa continued. "This probably isn't the first time they've dismissed your needs or your feelings. It's just the first time you've had X-ray evidence to prove them wrong." That night, alone in my apartment, I found myself thinking back through years of interactions with my family. How many times had my concerns been brushed off as overreacting? How many times had I been made to feel like my needs were secondary to Jake's achievements or my parents' convenience? I remembered being sick with what turned out to be mono during my junior year of college, but spending weeks being told I was just stressed about exams before I finally got so weak I couldn't get out of bed. I thought about the car accident I'd mentioned to my mom. Yes, it hadn't been a concussion, but I'd had persistent headaches for weeks afterward that no one took seriously until they finally subsided on their own. There was a pattern here, and seeing it clearly for the first time was almost as painful as the fractures in my ankle. My surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Thursday morning. I'd arranged for Melissa to drive me to the hospital since I couldn't drive myself, and honestly wasn't sure I wanted my family there for such a vulnerable moment. But my parents insisted on coming, arriving at my apartment at 5:30 a.m. with coffee and nervous energy. The drive to the hospital was tense. Mom kept asking if I had everything I needed, if I'd followed all the pre-surgery instructions, if I was scared. Dad sat in the front passenger seat, making awkward small talk about traffic and the weather.
Nobody mentioned our fight from the previous week, but it hung over everything like smoke. Jake met us at the hospital, looking uncharacteristically serious. He'd brought me a card and a small succulent plant, his girlfriend Riley's idea, I suspected, since Jake had never bought a plant in his life. "I wanted to give you this before you go in," he said, handing me the card. Inside, he'd written a longer message than I'd ever received from him. "Athena, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I let my friends dismiss your injury. I'm sorry I made you feel like you couldn't trust your own body. You're tougher than any of us gave you credit for, and I promise I'll do better." It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd gotten from anyone in my family, and despite everything, it meant something to me. The pre-surgery routine was a blur of paperwork, hospital gowns, and increasingly potent medications. Dr. Martinez stopped by to review the procedure one more time and answer any last-minute questions. He was confident but realistic about the complexity of what lay ahead. "We'll take good care of you," he promised. "When you wake up, those bones will be properly aligned and stabilized. The healing process will take time, but we're giving your ankle the best possible chance to recover fully." As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I caught a glimpse of my family in the waiting area. Mom was crying quietly while Dad patted her shoulder. Jake was staring at his phone, probably texting updates to his friends. They looked small and worried, and for a moment I felt a pang of sympathy for them. But then the anesthesia kicked in, and everything went dark. I woke up hours later in recovery with the strangest sensation of profound relief mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. My left leg was encased in what looked like a space-age boot, elevated and wrapped in ice packs. The pain was there, but muted, filtered through whatever cocktail of medications they'd given me. Dr. Martinez appeared beside my bed with a satisfied expression. "The surgery went very well. We were able to repair all 3 fractures and restore proper alignment. The plates and screws are in position, and everything looks exactly as we hoped." He showed me post-surgery x-rays on a tablet, pointing out the metallic hardware that was now permanently part of my anatomy. It looked alien and mechanical, but oddly reassuring. My bones were finally where they were supposed to be. "How long was I under?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube. 4.5 hours. It was complex work, but we took our time to make sure everything was perfect. 4.5 hours? I'd been walking around with injuries severe enough to require 4.5 hours of surgery, while my family told me to stop being dramatic. As I was moved to my overnight room, I overheard a conversation between Dr. Martinez and my parents in the hallway. My hearing was still fuzzy from the anesthesia, but I caught fragments. "Extensive damage. Remarkable that she was mobile at all. Most patients would have been immobilized immediately. Significant injury that required complex repair." When my family came to visit me in my room, they looked shaken. Mom's eyes were red from crying, and Dad kept clearing his throat like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "The doctor said the surgery was more complicated than he expected," Mom said quietly, settling into the chair beside my bed. "He said you've been walking around with injuries that should have put you in a wheelchair," Dad added, his voice rough. "He couldn't believe you were functioning at all." Jake stood at the foot of my bed, looking younger than his 21 years. "Athena, I keep thinking about that hike, about how you kept saying something was really wrong, and we didn't listen." "We failed you," Mom said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "As your family, as your parents, we completely failed you when you needed us most." It was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for, but hearing it now, drugged and exhausted in a hospital bed, it felt hollow. The time for that recognition had been 2.5 weeks ago, when I was hobbling around on crutches, begging someone to take my pain seriously. "The doctor wants to keep you overnight for observation," Dad said, clearly trying to move to more practical matters. "I'll be fine," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Melissa is coming by later. You all should go home and get some rest." Something in my tone must have conveyed that this wasn't really a suggestion, because after a few minutes of awkward conversation, my family gathered their things and headed for the door. As they were leaving, Mom turned back one more time. "Athena, honey, we're going to do better. We're going to make this right." But as I lay there in the quiet hospital room, watching the pain medication drip slowly into my IV, I wondered if some things could ever really be made right, or if the trust between us had been fractured as thoroughly as the bones in my ankle. Recovery was nothing like I'd imagined. The hospital had discharged me the next morning with a wheelchair, a knee scooter, and enough pain medication to stock a small pharmacy. But what they couldn't prepare me for was the psychological impact of being completely dependent on others for basic tasks. My apartment, which I'd loved for its independence and cozy charm, became an obstacle course. The narrow bathroom doorway barely accommodated my wheelchair. The kitchen counters were too high to reach from a seated position. Simple tasks like making coffee or taking a shower required elaborate planning and assistance. Melissa had taken time off work to help me get settled, and watching her navigate my living space with military efficiency made me realize how unprepared I was for this new reality. "We need to rearrange everything," she announced, surveying my kitchen. "You can't reach anything from that chair, and these stairs to your bedroom are going to be impossible." She was right. My apartment was a split-level design, with the bedroom upstairs, something that had felt sophisticated when I'd signed the lease, but now seemed like cruel irony. Climbing stairs was absolutely forbidden for the first 8 weeks of recovery. "I guess I'm sleeping on the couch," I said, trying to keep my voice light, but the reality of my situation was starting to sink in. 8 weeks, 2 months of being confined to the ground floor of my own apartment, dependent on others for help with basic human functions. "Actually, I've been thinking about that," Melissa said, perching on my coffee table so we could talk at eye level. "You should come stay with me. My guest room is on the first floor, and I've got a walk-in shower that'll be easier for you to manage." The offer was generous, but something about it made me uncomfortable. "I can't impose on you like that. I'll figure it out here." "Athena, this isn't about imposing. This is about accepting help when you need it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You know, maybe part of why your family didn't take your injury seriously is because you've always been so independent, so determined to handle everything yourself." "Are you saying this is my fault?" "No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is that asking for help doesn't make you weak or dramatic. It makes you human." That afternoon, my parents arrived with groceries, cleaning supplies, and what appeared to be every mobility aid available on Amazon. Dad had purchased a shower chair, grab bars, a reacher grabber tool, and a bedside commode that he began assembling with the focused intensity of a man trying to build his way out of guilt. Mom busied herself reorganizing my kitchen, moving frequently used items to lower shelves and stocking my refrigerator with enough pre-made meals to feed a small army. She moved with nervous energy, as if staying busy could somehow undo the past few weeks. "I've been researching recovery timelines," she announced, consulting a notebook filled with printouts from medical websites. "The first 2 weeks are critical for proper healing. You need to keep your foot elevated above your heart as much as possible, ice regularly, and take your pain medication on schedule." It was strange seeing my mother in full caretaker mode. Growing up, she'd always been loving but somewhat hands-off, trusting Jake and me to be self-sufficient. Seeing her frantically researching my medical condition felt like she was trying to make up for lost time. Jake showed up that evening with dinner from my favorite Thai restaurant and an unexpected confession. "I've been thinking about what happened on the mountain," he said, settling into the chair across from my makeshift bed on the couch. "Jake, we don't have to."
Yes, we do, because I've been replaying it in my head, and I keep remembering things I didn't want to see at the time. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Like how you went completely white when you fell. Like the sound your ankle made when it twisted. Like how you couldn't put any weight on it at all." I stayed quiet, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. "I knew it was bad, Athena. Part of me knew it right away. But Connor and Brett were saying it was fine, and Riley was complaining about missing the sunset.
And it was easier to believe them than to deal with the fact that I'd brought my sister somewhere dangerous, and she got seriously hurt. So you chose to believe I was being dramatic instead. I chose to believe what was convenient, and I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. It was the most honest conversation Jake and I had ever had. For the first time, he wasn't the golden child or the star athlete. He was just my younger brother, grappling with the realization that his choices had consequences for other people. There's something else, he continued. I talked to Brett about what happened, about his medical assessment on the mountain. And he admitted he had no idea what he was looking at. He said he just didn't want to be the one responsible for ruining everyone's plans, so he told us what we wanted to hear. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Brett had essentially performed medical theater, giving an authoritative diagnosis he wasn't qualified to make because it was socially convenient. And my family had accepted his opinion over my own experience of my body because it allowed them to continue their day as planned. I'm never hiking with those guys again, Jake said quietly. I'm done pretending that being tough means ignoring when people need help. Physical therapy started 3 weeks after surgery, and it was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sarah Chen, my physical therapist, was a tiny woman with the grip strength of a professional arm wrestler and absolutely no patience for self-pity. Your ankle is going to hurt, she told me during our first session. It's going to hurt for months. The question is whether you're going to let that pain control your recovery or whether you're going to work with it. The exercises started simple, flexing my toes, rotating my ankle in tiny circles while keeping my leg elevated. But even these basic movements sent shooting pains up my leg that made me gasp. Good, Sarah said when she saw me wince. Pain means the nerves are working. Pain means you're healing. She explained that the metallic hardware in my ankle would always be there, that I'd probably set off metal detectors for the rest of my life, and that weather changes might make my ankle ache in ways I'd never experienced before. But the human body is remarkably adaptable, she added. Patients who do their exercises religiously, who push through the discomfort and trust the process, often regain nearly full function. Those who baby their injuries and avoid pain never fully heal. It was a philosophy that stood in stark contrast to how my family had treated my injury. Instead of encouraging me to push through discomfort, they'd dismissed my pain entirely. Instead of supporting my recovery, they'd prevented me from getting treatment. Dr. Martinez monitored my progress with regular X-rays and appointments. 6 weeks post-surgery, he showed me images that revealed the bones were healing properly, the hardware was in the correct position, and I was cleared to begin putting minimal weight on my ankle. You're healing remarkably well, he told me, especially considering how long you went without treatment. Your body has been working overtime to repair the damage. What would have happened if I'd waited longer to get surgery? He considered the question carefully. The displacement in your talus was severe. Another few weeks, and we might have been looking at bone death, permanent deformity, or the need for ankle fusion surgery. You got treatment just in time. Just in time. 3 broken bones, 4.5 hours of surgery, months of recovery, and permanent hardware in my ankle, and I'd gotten treatment just in time. The alternative didn't bear thinking about. My relationship with my family evolved slowly during those weeks of recovery. They were all making genuine efforts to be more supportive, more attentive to my needs. Dad installed grab bars in my bathroom without being asked. Mom called every day to check on my pain levels and medication schedule. Jake started researching adaptive equipment for people with mobility challenges, sending me links to everything from shower seats to ergonomic kitchen tools. But despite their efforts, something fundamental had shifted between us. Trust, once broken, didn't heal as straightforwardly as bones did. Every interaction felt slightly performative, as if they were all trying to prove they could be the family I'd needed them to be 3 months earlier. The most difficult conversation came during a family dinner 8 weeks post-surgery, my first time back at my parents' house since that confrontation in the kitchen. I was finally cleared for limited weight-bearing, walking with a boot and a single crutch, and my parents had planned what they called a celebration meal. But sitting around that familiar table, picking at Mom's pot roast, I felt like a stranger. The dynamic that had defined our family for 24 years, Jake as the achiever, me as the responsible older sister, parents who valued toughness over vulnerability, had been exposed as fundamentally flawed. "I've been thinking," I said during a lull in conversation, "about how we handle medical issues going forward." The table went quiet. Everyone knew this conversation was coming, but nobody wanted to be the first to address it. I need to know that if something like this happens again, to me or to anyone in this family, we're going to take it seriously from the beginning. "Of course," Mom said quickly. "Absolutely. We've learned our lesson." Have we? Because I'm not talking about just believing medical diagnoses when we see x-rays. I'm talking about believing in each other when we say we're in pain. I'm talking about trusting each other's experiences instead of dismissing them as inconvenient or dramatic. Dad cleared his throat. "Athena, I think we all understand now that we made mistakes." "This wasn't a mistake, Dad. This was a pattern. And until we address the pattern, nothing's really changed." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Because the reality was that my ankle would heal, but the fundamental dynamics that had led to this situation, the dismissal of my experiences, the assumption that I was being dramatic, the prioritization of convenience over compassion, those patterns ran much deeper than any broken bone. 3 months into my recovery, I received an unexpected call that would change everything. It was from Marcus, my ex-boyfriend, whom I hadn't spoken to since our breakup 6 months earlier. He'd heard about my accident through mutual friends and wanted to check on me. "I can't believe your family dismissed it for so long," he said during our conversation. "That's so unlike you to exaggerate anything medical. You're usually the one downplaying injuries." His comment stuck with me because it highlighted something I'd been struggling to articulate. People who knew me well, Melissa, my coworkers, even Marcus, despite our complicated history, had never questioned the severity of my injury. It was only my family, the people who supposedly knew me best, who had dismissed my experience as dramatic. This realization led me to make a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I started seeing a therapist. Dr. Rebecca Torres was recommended by my physical therapist, Sarah, who had noticed that my emotional healing seemed to be lagging behind my physical recovery. Dr. Torres specialized in family dynamics and medical trauma, and she had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things. "Tell me about growing up in your family," she said during our first session. "What were the spoken and unspoken rules about expressing pain or needing help?" The question opened floodgates I didn't even know existed. I found myself talking about a childhood where strength was valued above vulnerability, where Jake's athletic achievements were celebrated while my academic successes were simply expected. I talked about learning early that being low maintenance was a virtue, that not causing problems was how you earned love and approval.
It sounds like your family operates on a hierarchy of whose needs matter most, Dr. Torres observed, and you learned to place yourself at the bottom of that hierarchy. She was right. I had spent years minimizing my own needs, dismissing my own instincts, and apologizing for taking up space. The ankle injury hadn't created these patterns, it had just revealed them in the starkest possible terms. "What happens now?" I asked. "How do I rebuild relationships with people who fundamentally misunderstood who I am for my entire life?" "That depends," she said. "Do you want to rebuild the same relationships, or do you want to build new ones based on who you actually are?" The question haunted me for weeks, because the truth was, I wasn't sure my family was capable of seeing me differently. Even their current efforts to be more supportive felt performative, like they were following a script for how to treat someone with a medical condition, rather than genuinely understanding what had gone wrong. My return to work provided an unexpected contrast. My boss Jennifer and my colleagues had been nothing but supportive throughout my recovery. They'd sent flowers, covered my projects, and welcomed me back with flexible accommodations that allowed me to work from home when my ankle was particularly painful. "You know," Jennifer said during one of our check-ins, "I have to say, watching how you've handled this whole situation has really impressed me. You've been incredibly professional and resilient." Even though I missed 3 months of work?
You didn't miss work. You had a medical emergency that required extended treatment. There's a difference. She leaned back in her chair. I hope you know that your value to this company isn't contingent on never getting injured or never needing help. The contrast between my workplace's response and my family's initial reaction was stark. At work, my injury was treated as exactly what it was, a serious medical situation that required time and accommodation to resolve. With my family, it had been framed as a character flaw, a sign of weakness or attention-seeking behavior. The 6-month mark brought significant milestones. My physical therapy sessions were reduced to twice a week. I was cleared to drive again, which felt like reclaiming a crucial piece of independence. Most importantly, Dr. Martinez's latest X-rays showed complete bone healing with excellent alignment. The hardware can stay in permanently, he explained, showing me the images. Some patients choose to have it removed once the bones are fully healed, but it's not necessary unless it causes discomfort. You'll always have some limitations. Your ankle will never be quite as flexible as it was before, but you should be able to return to most normal activities. What about running? I was training for a half marathon before this happened. Running is definitely possible, but you'll need to build up gradually and listen to your body. The days of ignoring pain and pushing through discomfort are over. Your ankle will always be a vulnerable point that requires attention and care. It was a metaphor that extended far beyond my physical recovery. The days of ignoring emotional pain and pushing through relationship discomfort were over too. The real test came during Jake's graduation from Portland State. He was receiving his degree in kinesiology and had been offered a graduate assistantship to continue his studies. The whole family gathered for the ceremony, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were all trying to pretend everything was back to normal. But during the reception afterward, Jake pulled me aside for a private conversation that revealed how much had really changed. I've been thinking about changing my focus, he said, unusually serious for what should have been a celebration. Instead of sports medicine, I want to specialize in emergency assessment, learning how to properly evaluate injuries when people can't get to a hospital right away. Because of what happened to me? Because of how badly I screwed up what happened to you. He looked directly at me, something he'd had trouble doing for months. I keep thinking about other people in situations like ours, hikers or athletes, or just regular people who get hurt when medical help isn't immediately available. And I keep thinking about how my arrogance and ignorance could have cost you your ability to walk normally. Jake, no, let me finish. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure I never make that kind of mistake again, and I'm going to teach other people how to recognize when injuries are serious, even when the person who's hurt seems tough or independent. It was the most mature thing I'd ever heard my brother say, and it gave me hope that maybe some good could come from everything we'd been through. The conversation with my parents proved more complicated. They had made consistent efforts to be more attentive and supportive, but there was still an underlying resistance to acknowledging the deeper issues that my injury had revealed.
We've all learned from this experience, Mom said when I tried to bring up our family patterns during a quiet moment at the graduation party. We're more aware now of how serious medical issues can be. But Mom, this wasn't just about not recognizing a medical issue. This was about not trusting my judgment, not believing my experience, not taking my needs seriously. Honey, we've apologized for that. We've all been trying to do better. I know you have, and I appreciate the effort, but apologizing for the outcome isn't the same as understanding the underlying problem. The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. I explained how their responses to my injury had revealed patterns that went back years. The dismissal of my concerns, the assumption that I was being dramatic, the expectation that I should always be low maintenance and self-sufficient. Dad struggled the most with this perspective. We raised you to be strong and independent. Those aren't bad qualities. No, they're not. But there's a difference between being strong and being ignored when you need help. There's a difference between being independent and being dismissed when you express vulnerability. Dr. Torres had prepared me for this conversation, warning me that not everyone would be ready to examine these deeper patterns.
Change, she'd explained, required not just acknowledgement of specific mistakes, but a willingness to question fundamental assumptions about how relationships work. As my recovery progressed into its 8th month, I realized that healing had become a much broader project than just fixing my ankle. I was rebuilding my understanding of what healthy relationships looked like, what it meant to advocate for myself, and how to maintain connections with people while still honoring my own needs and experiences. My family and I were finding a new equilibrium. It wasn't the same as our old dynamic. Too much had been revealed and too much had changed for that, but it was honest in a way our relationships had never been before. Jake had become a genuine ally, someone who actively worked to understand and support my perspective. Mom and Dad were making sincere efforts, though they sometimes struggled with the deeper implications of what had happened. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own instincts and advocate for my own needs, regardless of how others responded. The ankle that had once been fractured in 3 places was now stronger than it had been before, reinforced with titanium plates and screws that would be part of me forever. The family relationships that had been broken by dismissal and neglect were slowly being rebuilt too, with better communication and deeper understanding serving as the hardware that held us together. Some fractures, I learned, heal stronger than they were before they broke. Others leave permanent reminders of their damage. The key was learning to tell the difference and knowing that healing was always possible, even when it looked different than what came before. A year after my accident on Mount Tabor, I completed my first 5K race. My time was slower than it would have been before my injury, and my ankle ached for days afterward. But crossing that finish line, with Jake cheering from the sidelines and my parents holding a homemade sign with my name on it, felt like reclaiming something essential about who I was. I was still Athena Adams. I was still strong, still independent, still resilient. But now I was also someone who trusted her own experience, who demanded to be heard when she was in pain, and who understood that asking for help wasn't a weakness. It was a prerequisite for real healing. The X-ray that had silenced my family's dismissal had done more than reveal broken bones. It had revealed broken patterns, broken assumptions, and broken trust. And in the long, difficult work of healing all those fractures, we had built something stronger than what we'd had before. 2 years after my accident, I found myself back on Mount Tabor. Not hiking the treacherous, unofficial trails where I'd been injured, but walking the paved paths with my physical therapist, Sarah, who had become something of a friend during our long journey together. "How does it feel?" she asked, as we paused at one of the scenic overlooks, the city of Portland spread out below us. I flexed my ankle experimentally, feeling the familiar tightness that would always be there, the subtle reminder of titanium plates and screws that had become part of my body. "Different," I said honestly, "but not broken." It was an apt metaphor for more than just my ankle. My relationship with my family had evolved into something unrecognizable from what it had been before. More honest, more challenging, but ultimately more authentic. The biggest change had come 6 months earlier, when my Aunt Carol had fallen and broken her wrist during a family gathering. Instead of the dismissive response that had characterized my injury, the entire family had sprung into action. Dad drove her to the emergency room immediately, Mom coordinated with her doctors and insurance, Jake researched the best orthopedic specialists in her area. But what struck me most was a moment when Aunt Carol apologized for making such a fuss over what she called just a broken wrist. "There's no such thing as just a broken bone," my father had said firmly, glancing at me across the waiting room. "Any injury that causes pain deserves to be taken seriously." It was a complete reversal of his previous philosophy, and seeing him apply the lessons we'd all learned to someone else's situation felt like validation that our family had genuinely changed. My career had taken an unexpected turn as well. Working with Dr. Torres had helped me recognize that my experience with medical dismissal wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern, particularly affecting women, where pain and symptoms were routinely minimized or attributed to psychological causes. I'd started volunteering with a patient advocacy organization, helping people navigate situations where their medical concerns weren't being taken seriously. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply meaningful. I found that my experience gave me credibility with both patients and medical professionals in ways that traditional advocates sometimes lacked. I've been where you are. I could tell someone struggling to get their symptoms acknowledged. I know how isolating it feels when the people who are supposed to help you don't believe you're really suffering. One case particularly resonated with me. A woman named Patricia Chen, no relation to my physical therapist Sarah, had been experiencing severe abdominal pain for months. Multiple doctors had attributed her symptoms to stress, anxiety, or women's problems. Her family had begun to echo these dismissals, suggesting she was being hypochondriacal or attention-seeking. I helped Patricia document her symptoms, research her condition, and find specialists who would take her seriously. When she was finally diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that required immediate treatment, her family was forced to confront how badly they'd failed to support her. "Thank you for believing me when no one else would," she said during one of our final meetings. "I was starting to think I was losing my mind." Her words echoed my own experience so closely that I had to excuse myself to cry in the bathroom afterward. The work was healing parts of me I didn't even know were still wounded. Jake had kept his promise about changing his career focus. He was now in graduate school studying emergency medicine and trauma assessment, with a particular interest in developing better protocols for field injury evaluation. He'd even published a paper on the psychological factors that lead to misdiagnosis of serious injuries in non-medical settings. "I cite your case study," he told me during one of our monthly coffee dates, a tradition we'd started as part of rebuilding our relationship. "Obviously with your permission and anonymized details, but your experience is helping train the next generation of first responders and wilderness guides. How do you feel about that? Using what happened to me as a teaching tool?" He considered the question seriously. Jake had developed a thoughtfulness over the past 2 years that was entirely new. "I feel like it's the least I can do. If other people can learn from my mistakes, maybe some good comes from how badly I screwed up." Our parents had made their own adjustments, though theirs were perhaps the most tentative. Mom had become almost hyper-vigilant about family health issues, sometimes overcorrecting in the opposite direction from her previous dismissiveness. When I mentioned having a headache, she'd immediately suggest I see a doctor. When Jake complained about sore muscles after a workout, she'd research potential underlying conditions. "You don't have to panic every time someone mentions being in pain," I told her gently during one of these episodes. "The goal is to listen and take things seriously, not to assume everything is a catastrophe." Finding the balance was an ongoing process for all of us. Dad had perhaps made the most surprising transformation. He'd started volunteering with a veterans organization, helping former military personnel navigate medical advocacy, something he'd never shown interest in before my accident. "A lot of these guys are used to toughing things out," he explained when I asked about his new involvement. "They don't know how to ask for help when they need it, and the system doesn't always listen when they do." It was clear he was working through his own understanding of strength, vulnerability, and what it meant to support people who are struggling. In helping others advocate for their medical needs, he was learning lessons that extended far beyond healthcare. The legal resolution of my case had taken nearly a year to complete. Dr. Martinez had documented extensively how the delayed treatment had complicated my injuries and recovery. While there was no legal liability for my family's response, medical neglect by family members isn't a crime. My insurance company had pursued a claim against the hiking trail maintenance company for the unsafe conditions that had caused my fall. The settlement wasn't large, but it covered my medical expenses and provided some compensation for the extended recovery time. More importantly, it led to improved safety measures on the unofficial trails around Mount Tabor, potentially preventing other hikers from experiencing similar injuries. Melissa had remained my closest confidant throughout the entire experience. She'd been the one to celebrate small milestones with me. The first time I walked without crutches, the first time I drove myself to physical therapy, the first time I completed a full day at work without ankle pain. "You know what I'm proudest of?" she said during a recent dinner at our favorite restaurant. "It's not that you physically recovered from the injury, it's that you figured out how to stand up for yourself." She was right. The person who had limped into that family kitchen with x-rays 2 years ago was different from who I was now. I'd learned to trust my own experiences, to demand being heard when I expressed concerns, and to maintain relationships while still honoring my own needs. This transformation had extended beyond my family relationships. At work, I'd become more assertive about workload and boundaries. In friendships, I'd learned to speak up when I felt overlooked or dismissed. In dating, I'd recently started seeing someone new. I'd developed a radar for people who minimized my feelings or experiences. Red flags I never would have noticed before, I explained to Dr. Torres during one of our periodic check-in sessions. When someone dismisses my concerns or tells me I'm overreacting, I don't try to convince them anymore. I just remove myself from situations where my perspective isn't valued. Dr. Torres smiled. That's what healthy boundaries look like. You've learned to protect yourself without becoming defensive or closed off. The physical reminders of my injury were permanent. My ankle ached before storms, a reliable barometer that other people found amusing, but that served as a constant reminder of what I'd survived. I'd never run as fast as I had before my accident, and certain movements would always be limited. But these limitations had taught me something valuable about adaptation and resilience. I'd learned to modify activities rather than avoid them entirely, to listen to my body's signals rather than ignore them, and to find new ways of challenging myself that didn't require pretending I was invulnerable. The half marathon I'd been training for before my accident remained unfinished business. I'd registered for one scheduled 6 months from now, with a training plan modified for my ankle's limitations and a pace goal that prioritized completion over speed. "Are you nervous about it?" Jake asked when I told the family about my registration. "Nervous, excited, determined," I said, "but mostly grateful. Grateful that I can run at all. Grateful that I have people who will support me regardless of my time. And grateful that I've learned the difference between pushing through pain and pushing through challenges." Standing on Mount Tabor that afternoon with Sarah, looking out over the city where I'd rebuilt my life and relationships, I realized that my story had become something different than I'd expected. It wasn't just a story about medical dismissal or family dysfunction or personal vindication. It was a story about what happens when you refuse to accept being diminished, about learning to trust yourself when others don't, about the difference between healing and simply surviving. My ankle would always carry the scars and hardware from that day on the mountain, but the person I'd become in the process of healing was stronger, more authentic, and more compassionate than the person I'd been before. Sometimes the most important fractures aren't the ones that show up on X-rays. Sometimes the most significant healing happens not in bones and tissue, but in understanding your own worth and demanding that others recognize it too. The mountain that had broken me had also taught me how to rebuild myself, not as I was before, but as someone better equipped to navigate a world that doesn't always listen the first time you say you're in pain. And as I walked down those paved paths, my ankles stable beneath me and my family's respect finally earned, I understood that the real victory hadn't been silencing their doubts with medical evidence. It had been learning to trust my own voice loudly enough that their silence no longer mattered. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.